Republican instead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hi everyone, I'm Stuart Stevens, filling in today for the under the weather road warrior Rick Wilson. Rick, take care and feel better, man. Today on the enemies list is the third episode of David Pepper's incredible creation, Trump's Project 2025, Up Close and Personal. The special 12-episode series is a joint David Pepper and Resolute Square production. Today's issue, The Death of Science, envisions what would happen if another pandemic broke out during Trump's second term. We know how horribly he handled the first, and with incompetence like RFK Jr. nominated to run HHS, there is every reason to believe Pandemic 2.0 would be far worse. The confirmation hearings for Trump's nominees kicked off yesterday with the spectacularly unqualified Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. Hegseth has been credibly accused of sexual assault, alcohol abuse on the job, financial mismanagement, and even his own mother has called him out for his treatment of women, including his own wife. He has never successfully run anything. His misogyny has been on display in his own words dating back to 2012, when he first began disparaging the enormous contributions of women in the military. As recently as a couple of months ago, he was proudly declaring that women have no place in combat units and implies that women and members of minorities end up being advanced in the military because of quotas, not qualifications. The guy is disgusting. This is the lack of qualifications and character that Donald Trump looks for in his nominees. And in his nominee for HHS, he certainly succeeded by nominating RFK Jr. So, I invite you to listen to this new episode, The Death of Science, narrated by C.J. Pounder and Jay Kravitz, and imagine it taking place with RFK Jr. leading America's healthcare.
Chapter 3, Capital Monthly, Yvette Hardman by Rose Cunningham, Washington, D.C.
You've got to be kidding me.
The boyish, bleached blonde Chip Manson barked over the large rectangular table where a dozen people were sitting.
Shut down the entire facility. No way in hell are we going to do that. You want to turn the whole country upside down?
It was just the first of 10 recommendations Yvette Hardman planned to make at that meeting. And now a comms kid from the White House, who had no business running this meeting, was already throwing it back in her face. Yvette stole a quick glance to her right, towards the stately Dr. James Turekian, her only ally at the table, and the only other person qualified to be at the table before responding. 2 scientists, 2 civil servants, facing down whoever all these newcomers were. They'd gamed out their approach with some of the premier national experts on avian flu. Mr. Manson, she said calmly, patting several thick binders next to her, including the pandemic playbook. That step comes directly from the protocol that multiple White Houses have agreed to for years, going back to President Bush, at the first sign of multiple victims with severe respiratory distress.
Excuse me?
Manson yelled back, speckles of saliva hitting the table as his long, thin face turned beet red.
Are you referring to that fucking playbook again?
One by one, over the prior 8 weeks, experts like themselves had been ushered out of the nation's most important federal posts across all agencies with missions to prevent another pandemic. Meeting formally since fall of 2024 through January 2025, they'd watched in alarm as growing signs of avian flu in livestock in the South and Midwest portended the virus spreading to humans. They were now only one bad mutation and sloppy response away from a COVID-level crisis. The drama of the election and the victory of a science-denying candidate had kept the risk out of the national spotlight, when faceless, undocumented immigrants in the shadows of rural America were the first ones to get sick. That didn't make the news either. Now here they were, with Americans largely clueless about the potential for a devastating pandemic. Also clueless, Yvette thought, were these blank new faces now sitting around the table, the ones who'd replaced all those experts and scientists fired since January. Following Chip Manson's absurd tirade, the new crew turned towards Yvette. 8 white men, 1 white woman, most had shown up for the first time at the February meeting, held deep in the dingy bowels of the old executive office building, since the president's elimination of the West Wing's Office for Pandemic Preparedness. The second time, the same president had axed it. The first time had left the country fatally unprepared for COVID-19 in 2020. But no one who'd learned from that mistake was back now. This new administration wanted to again play down the whole thing and stick a partisan political hack at its helm, meaning politics would motivate the work. No science at all, not real disease prevention. 3 more new faces joined them for this meeting. And as in the prior meeting, all 3 walked in clinging to a glossy manual with a large photo of the president on its cover. No one had given Yvette a copy, but the content looked more political than official. Only Yvette and Dr. Terekian were left to witness the dramatic downgrade of public health personnel in such a short time. The public health experts whom these people replaced had more than 2 centuries among them of the world's richest experience, researching, tracking, and preventing the disease they were now confronting. Scientists and researchers and security experts, doctors and veterinarians, all at the top of their fields, and critically, they'd worked together long enough that they comprised a live, interconnected web of pandemic fighters. They played it all out, challenged every assumption, refined every contingency plan, and all that work had led to the playbook Yvette had in front of her. No group had been better prepared on the planet for what they face. Yvette looked out at the ruins of it all. The new people staring at her were there largely due to recent political activity, fierce anti-science ideology, or industry ties. Maybe they'd set the budget for a local health department or sewer system. No direct experience. 2 had even been fake electors from the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, rewarded for their loyalty. On paper, the brightest at the table were transplants from the right-wing think tanks, smart, but driven by ideology. From those high-paying and corporate-backed ivory towers, they'd written tomes recommending the exact opposite of the playbook guidance. One had expounded on herd immunity as the best solution, citing pseudo-studies from small countries. Let it spread fast, he advocated, which Yvette knew would kill millions. Her heart beat faster. Chip, we have war-gamed the scenario for years. Once multiple workers at a facility like this show serious symptoms, it means a new mutation may have occurred. We have to shut the plant down and begin detection and containment measures. The risk of spread is high, even if we do all that. Like tennis spectators, those around the table swivel their heads back Chip's way. Science versus politics, politics versus science. But unlike a good tennis match, all knew who would win, including Yvette, because November had settled that contest. Chip Manson made up for in anger what he lacked in age and stature. Couldn't have been older than mid-30s, skinny, his blonde hair thinning fast up both sides of his forehead. Eyes always seemed wide and red, a slick-talking political aide hired away from a Freedom Caucus House member. As young as he was, Chip had the one thing that counted these days in Washington. He was one of the president's closest confidants. That meant power. Raw, if intangible power. All of DC, including the new people at that table, adhere to that power now, which meant no one talked back to Chip Manson. He slammed his open hand hard against the table.
The minute you shut that place down, it's out. You not only piss off industry, but the press will run with this, panic starts, and prices go up. That screws the whole economy right when we're getting started.
One of the newcomers, an oversized man in a crumpled suit with thick round glasses and bad brown toupee, leaned forward and cleared his throat. One of the think tank transplants.
I talked to the plant's CEO this morning. He says they've got it handled. They'll isolate the sick workers. They're illegals anyway. So their families are down in Mexico or somewhere else. Sub in some others and keep going. The plant's in the middle of nowhere anyway.
The massive facility was actually near New Philadelphia, Ohio, about an hour from Cleveland, where Yvette had grown up, obsessed with becoming a veterinarian. She never thought she'd be in a room like this, representing the zoonotic infectious disease section of the Centers for Disease Control, defending the health of millions against an invisible virus and men like this. Heads on the man's left and right nodded, as if the confident got it handled. Assurance solved the problem.
Thank you, Dan. Very helpful to know. Thanks for showing some initiative.
Chip turned back to Yvette.
You okay with that?
He asked in a tone suggesting there was only one right answer. As they'd agreed before the meeting, Dr. Terekian now spoke up.
Sir, I'm afraid that won't work. There are already more workers sick than we know. This strain can incubate for up to 2 weeks without symptoms. And, as you say, these are immigrants. They bunk in overcrowded dormitories and drive to the plant packed 8 to 10 per vehicle. Out of fear, even after showing symptoms, most will hesitate to come forward. But the real problem is the meat itself. Those workers getting sick means that the plant is unsafe, and wherever that plant ships, its meat risks spreading it wider. It's a large-scale operation, which Dr. Hardman documents in her written presentation. As dramatic as it may feel, her recommendation is the correct one, and only the first of many.
No one but Chip and Dan from the think tank even looked at Terekian. These people were still high on the election win, arrogant, geared up for political fights, defying and standing up to the deep state of scientists and experts in the government. They won promising to do just that, which meant science and expertise had lost. And Yvette knew they certainly weren't there to listen to the recommendations from an African-American woman with long, braided cornrows, even if the silver cross she wore every day earned a quick, curious glance. They'd always return their gaze to her hair. A major goal of the president was to eliminate DEI from all federal agencies. So, Yvette knew that when these people looked her way, all they saw was DEI. Chip cleared his throat. Terekian had thrown enough in that it simply couldn't be dismissed.
Dan, please call the CEO and ask him about Dr. Terekian's concerns. Hopefully he can deal with them without having to shut down.
Yvette could feel her own temper boiling up, her body tensing. There was no way to deal with Dr. Terekian's concerns without a shutdown. 6 workers with severe symptoms from avian flu meant it was too late for that. Hell, given the 50% mortality rate, higher than even the peak of COVID-19 in early 2020, 3 of those workers would likely die in less than a week. If only these people knew the horror of how they would suffocate, alone, drowning in their own ravaged lungs. But Chip, even acknowledging Terekian's words, was a small step in the right direction, a tiny victory. Terekian knew it as well.
I'm happy to join the call with you. I've worked with industry often on issues like this.
Dan chortled, amused at the offer. Most of their other faces smiled too.
No need, Doc. You may have not gotten the memo yet, but industry's got a different attitude now that we're in charge. I'll make the call and report back.
Chip took charge again.
Okay, Dr. Hardman, that takes care of your first recommendation. Do you have any others?
Any others? Yvette thought. Narrowing it just to 10 had been work. Over the next 25 minutes, she managed to talk through 4 more steps. It didn't go well. The communication strategy was key, she explained, striking the perfect balance of making the crisis real enough to spur Americans to protect themselves and reduce spread, but not so dire or hopeless to induce panic. Gently and without blaming the president, she explained that had been one of the costly mistakes from 2020. What she didn't say is that they'd felt like storm chasers, warning of an imminent tornado as millions walked right past available shelters, and that the president's unscripted and cavalier words throughout had spurred the disastrous disconnect, leading to hundreds of thousands of needless deaths.
Next.
Chip said impatiently when she completed the page. For her third recommendation, just as they'd gamed it out, she praised the president's 2020 surge of the COVID-19 vaccine. Chip smirked and waved his hand.
Vaccines! Oh, you won't be doing that again this time.
All but 2 around the table laughed out loud.
I will not give 1 penny to any school that has a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate.
In just 4 years, the same president had entirely reversed his stance on vaccines, and his new crew reflected that. The next 2 steps were rejected just as quickly. As with the vaccine surge, all were rejected for hollow political considerations. No health, no science, no thought of any consequences beyond the next week's news cycle. If the nation were watching this meeting, they'd be horrified. So, facing the most dire risk of a major pandemic since COVID-19, a risk far more lethal than COVID, threatening to ravage much younger portions of the population, the meeting ended with a single agreed-to step. A resolution so asinine it left Yvette's stomach churning. A guy who recently worked at a think tank funded by industry, calling up the CEO of the infected meat processing plant to ask that CEO if they could quietly handle this massive risk to the American public themselves. The answer, of course, was no. But as she stood up from the hour from hell, Yvette knew full well the CEO would say yes. As Dan himself had suggested, the election result empowered that CEO to say yes. No follow-up questions needed. They didn't want to be seen leaving the meeting together. So she and Dr. Terekian took separate Ubers back to their respective offices. He to the Department of Health and Human Services, and she to the CDC, while debriefing over their burner cell phones.
You held firm in there, and the presentation you circulated with them at least leaves a paper trail. And you emailed it as well?
Sure did. In a group email to all of them. So glad you got your words in. Might have been the only time you've broken through with some of those people, and your clarity gives us a leg to stand on.
Yes, but Chip and that Dr. Fowler shut it down fast. That was pre-planned. That meat company is a major donor to the president. Fowler and Manson were reading off their corporate talking points.
I'm sure.
I'll fill the team in. You get back to your office.
Yvette eyed her flip phone uncomfortably as she closed it, her hands shaking. They knew all their emails were being read, government cell phones and texts no doubt listened to. Hopefully, they hadn't yet caught on to their new burners. She walked briskly to her office while exiting the elevator. 2 long hallways, usually clean and tidy, now strewn with boxes and papers, as a revolving door of new and old staff rotated in and out of the various offices along the way. The White House called it the Project 2025 Transition. and it was turning Washington upside down. She pictured it as a long, meandering line of dominoes falling all around her. Like all the other dominoes in line before her, she'd be toppled soon enough. There was so much to do.
Dr. Hardman, how'd it go?
A bright-eyed Michelle Simpkins greeted her as she entered her office. Miraculously, the 29-year-old aide, who'd graduated with a master's in public health from GW the prior year, had not received her HR visit yet. Awful, but about as expected. But they won't be able to deny that we laid it all out, either orally or in writing. How'd it go for you?
Oh, good.
And you talked to our friends in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan?
Sent it to all the places we talked about.
Within the network, some of the most useful allies were health directors and their respective governors in blue states. They maintained large state-level health and agriculture systems and experts, and willing to speak out. And they maintained good relations with in-state papers that were less intimidated by the new administration.
They said they'll leak it to their largest newspapers by close of business today. They expect it to hit the websites by 8 and to be on the front page of both newspapers by tomorrow morning.
Perfect. Even as she said the words, Yvette's stomach quivered. Leaking information like this was the opposite of the care and confidentiality with which she treated pandemic-related challenges over the years. It defied her instincts of trying to address crises without causing public panic. A real risk here. But what Chip Manson most wanted right now was the silence. America and its press corps, being in the dark, allowed the president to steer the federal government into a wildly reckless direction. If nobody on the outside knew the other options, the most dangerous path would be followed for all the worst reasons. If the White House didn't pursue their recommended course, the press would have a lot of obvious and tough questions to ask. Michelle, you should head out now. Take that laptop with you and don't bring it back in. Maybe best to get rid of it entirely. I'll get you another one. Michelle frowned.
Wow, you're that worried.
I am. We spoke up today. The culture they're creating doesn't allow for that. And when this leaks, it will get far worse. Either way, they'll want to blame us. Michelle walked over to the small table, closed the laptop, and placed it in a small black computer bag.
Okay, I'll head out now. Good luck.
They shared a quick hug and she left. Yvette sat down in the swivel chair at the desk and logged onto the desktop computer. She scrolled through emails that had come in since the morning, more grandiose pronouncements and new protocols from the new CDC leaders. Still, she fired off emails for the next 20 minutes, official-sounding communications to new staff, play-acting the role of a welcoming new boss, onboarding new personnel. Right before she pushed send on an email, the screen of her monitor went blank, then reset to the log-on page. Yvette retyped in her name and password. Error, unknown username and password. She typed it in again. Another error. Then came a knock on her door. She opened it. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-30s versus Yvette's 48, smiled awkwardly. She sported a brown ponytail and a shiny new badge on her chest. Human Relations, and she held a thick envelope in her hand. Yvette Hardman, Director, ZID, printed across the top. The woman's lips turned down into a grim frown.
Miss Hardman, I'm afraid this is the day that someone will be replacing you.
She handed her the envelope.
The first page walks through the departure protocol, but I can summarize. We have now terminated your access to your government phone and computer. You will need to have your personal items out of here by 3:30 p.m. at the latest.
Yvette looked at her watch. It was already 1:15 p.m. This office had been her home for almost 4 years. Others got until 6, is my understanding.
That's been our usual process, but we have a dilemma today.
Yvette shook her head, biting her lip. Dilemma?
Your successor is raring to go.
The woman said, glancing over Yvette's shoulder, clearly taking in the shape of the office.
He wants to stop in at 5 p.m. and start moving in.
Yvette looked down, squelching her temptation to lament her situation. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a few moments, then opened them again. No, there will be no mourning. This visit meant that all the work she'd done in recent weeks had been even more important. God's work. She now knew. Yvette stood taller, rolled her shoulders back, and cast a big smile back at the HR person. 3:30 it will be.
Now, when we come back after a short break, we'll meet the man who would replace Dr. Yvette Hardman. He's a man with no qualifications, but who'd be recruited by Trump's Project 2025. Again, we want to inform you that any profits from the advertising in this series will be donated to pro-democracy organizations. And now, stay tuned after the episode when the author, David Pepper, ties each of the story elements back to specific references in Project 2025 and Trump's own words. Hey, by the way, speaking of Trump's own words, he's repeatedly called for journalists who criticize him to be jailed. So it's not a stretch to see that the editor of our fictional magazine, Capital Monthly, takes steps to somehow discover the other side of the horrific stories that Rose Cunningham has already reported. This editorial change is documented by the new reporter he's assigned to the story, Calvin Stegman. The rest of Chapter 3 tells the story of J.J. Newsom, the kind of guy who'd be recruited by Project 2025 to serve in a second Trump administration.
Part 2. On Friday, my editor at the Capital Monthly pulled me into his office. He said that some readers and advertisers were complaining about Rose Cunningham's gripping series about how the new administration was impacting real people. I pushed back. It's amazing journalism, I've said. I've admired her work. I have as well, he said. She will keep doing her stories, but we need to add some balance to our coverage. He held up his fingers in quotation marks as he said the word balance. So he said I'd be moving from my beat covering Capitol Hill to take on a special assignment. You're going to spend some time in the field, he said. I'd spend the rest of the year depicting how the lives of everyday Americans were impacted by the new regime. Talk to Rose. She has a good nose for stories. Try to tell stories similar to hers, but from the other side. I flinched. What's wrong? Well, what's the other side of her last story? Or the first one? People celebrating the end of IVF? Or an INS agent celebrating protester deportations? He shrugged. Just come up with something. Her story will be the main story, but yours will be the balance. Be creative. Give the other side's view, and, of course, tell the truth. I shrugged. Sounded absurd. But I also knew the pressure he was under. Crowds were chanting fake news all over America because of stories like Rose's. The president himself was livid. Businesses were being pressured to pull advertising from those who weren't treating the president favorably. A few cameramen had been beaten up at his recent speeches. Rose had received death threats. And because of her stories, the Capital Monthly was clearly on the president's list of fake news. Okay, I said, I'll do my best. I gave Rose a call.
Capital Monthly, J.J. Newsom by Calvin Stegman. Washington, D.C.
Welcome to Washington, D.C.
When J.J. had traveled to Washington for the first time, it was during the Obama years. He remembered glowering at the storied monuments and government buildings. His blood had boiled knowing that hostile forces occupied those hallowed halls built by real Americans, meant to be led by real Americans. Then, he could hardly stomach the thought that the nation's capital was in those corrupt hands, the hands of people who used the power of the government to advance dark values that offended every principle he believed in. But today, for the first time in 4 years, America was America again. A chill of excitement ran down JJ's spine. Pride. His heart beat fast. Outside of a fierce temper that could erupt at his worst moments, he had never been an emotional man. But a tear ran down his cheek as they pulled up to the gate. The past 4 years had nearly broken him. But this journey would bring that difficult path to an ending he could not have imagined even months before. Movies didn't end as well as his life story was turning out. He told his wife Stella he was going to a conference in Washington. He just left out that the political conference on January 5th would culminate in a rally the next day with the former president, now finally the president again. Then a march to the Capitol to forcibly stop the vote count. The president had taken America back for real Americans like JJ, but the deep state conspired to topple their leader. They hyped the COVID pandemic to crush the economy and make his president look incompetent. That and the stolen election were the two final straws that convinced him he had to do something. So JJ stood back and stood by, just as the president asked.
But I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
And when the president urged them all to march up to the Capitol, both in the days leading up to January 6th and again during that fiery speech on the ellipse, JJ had charged up that hill with more gusto than he had on any Iraq battlefield years before. The rest of that day was a blur. But one too many cell phone pics and security cameras had caught him on tape, beating a Capitol Hill police officer with his own baton. The videos looked bad. The rage on his face, inflamed eyes snarl across his lips. And they captured all 23 times he'd swung at the cop, and that some of the blows had strayed above his legs. Yes, it looked bad. And the feds quickly tracked him down in Missouri. JJ tried to tell them that he wasn't trying to kill the young cop, just knocking him down, keeping him from obstructing the rest of the crowd from entering the building. They arrested him anyway. As guilty as the tapes made him look, he refused to plead guilty or apologize. After all, he'd been standing up for his country against those who would destroy it. But that stubborn recalcitrance got him sentenced to 10 years in jail. Among the longest sentences of anyone who breached the Capitol that day. While awful for him and his family, the lengthy sentence made him a hero among his fellow patriots. Admiring tweets, texts, and emails flooded in, encouraging him to stand strong.
Honey, I'm in the Uber, heading in.
His wife Stella remained back in Missouri. Rural Clay County was most famous for being the home of Jesse James, the namesake JJ had admired since he was a kid. More because he was a Confederate than because he was a bank robber.
I miss you already.
Stella and their 3 kids would move to D.C. once school was done and JJ had found a home.
I'm so proud of you, honey. We all are. You have earned all of this.
He did a double take as the tinted car window reflected his new look back at him. A close-cropped cut of his sandy blonde hair replaced the more shaggy look that he had had for years. He stroked his new goatee, which Stella said made him look more intelligent, more in command.
I wouldn't be here without you,
JJ said.
You were strong throughout it all. Far stronger than I've ever been.
His emotions suddenly got the best of him again. Tears flowed down his face as he spoke, which he wiped with the left sleeve of the new sport coat Stella had bought last week and left out for him this morning.
Honey, you and the kids saved me. I would never have made it this far.
He fell silent, remembering. From the moment of his arrest, Stella had understood, even though it had caught her completely off guard. She'd driven or flown to the federal prison, usually alone, leaving the kids with her parents, so many times. She never once questioned his refusal to show remorse or plead guilty.
You did the right thing, honey.
She said on every visit.
You fought for the country, and you stood up like the president asked you to. Someday, somehow, you will be rewarded for this.
At those lowest moments where her encouragement was all he had in his life, he just stared back at her over the wooden table in the visitor's room, fearful that she'd leave him and that the kids would forget him. But she never did. She assured him she wouldn't let them.
The kids are so proud of you. They tell their friends you're just like Jesse James, willing to fight for the right cause.
No words could have lifted him more than those. They kept him going through the hell of that prison, separated from his family, until the first of 2 phone calls that changed his life. As the Uber crossed Memorial Bridge with the white marble of the Lincoln Memorial directly in front of him, JJ remembered that first phone call late last year. Every word spoken would stick with him for the rest of his life. It was from his brother, Jasper. He too had stormed the Capitol, but was smart enough not to have attacked a cop with cameras rolling. While he'd pled out and served 1 year for his actions, he'd been advocating for his brother ever since. They joked that he was Frank James to JJ's Jesse.
We just got the call,
he'd said over the prison phone, the joy in his voice contrasting with JJ's somber mood. It was the 3rd anniversary of the guilty verdict.
Call from?
Jesse asked.
The transition team, of course. It's a long list. Almost everyone made it, you included. Amnesty? For all of us? You got it, brother. You will be out by the end of the day. Stella's on her way to get you.
And that was the first time JJ had cried since he was a kid. Stella was there by 5 p.m., and he was back in Clay County the next day. He celebrated Christmas with his family 2 weeks later. But it was the call just after New Year that caught him truly off guard. It was from Blake Fallows, the leader of the group that organized the conference that had led to their storming the Capitol. Blake, too, had been sentenced and pardoned and had kept close ties to the president's people.
JJ, they want you, dude,
Blake said.
They want you.
Who wants me?
The president does, and his people. They love that you were willing to take one for the team. No apologies, no remorse. That's fucking loyalty. Willing to give up 10 years for the president, for the country. You're a fucking patriot, and they know it.
So what do they want me to do?
Oh, they got thousands of jobs to fill in this new administration. They want you to take one. They want to make a point to the country. Taking people like you, the most patriotic of the loyalists, and putting you into the most important jobs out there. Visible ones. It'll send a message.
Fuck yeah, JJ said, not having worked since returning home, watching the bills add up with no way to keep up on Stella's teacher salary. What kind of jobs you talking about?
I got a list I can send you. Some really cool jobs. They said to pick the one you want and they'll make it happen. Only thing is, you need to move fast because they're offering the same to a few others too.
Partly because of his temper, JJ had never been great at steady work. After being discharged from the army, he'd worked his uncle's farm, and then he'd signed up for police training, spent time as a village cop, then transferred over to the Clay County Sheriff's Department. Too many complaints led to a transfer to probation, where he served as an officer, but he hated that. So eventually he got a job as staffer in the county's health department, dealing with a wide variety of issues. He never was very good at it, as any look at his file would attest, but paid the bills, got him out of the office most days, and didn't take a ton of work. So he did it for a number of years, moved his way up to managing 3 other staffers. When Stella typed up all he'd done on a resume, they were pleased at how good they could make it all look. Veteran, police officer, deputy sheriff, county health official. I'd hire you, Blake joked, even if under the surface, JJ hadn't done much good since his days in Iraq. And truth be told, he even had a criminal record before January 6th, something he confessed to Blake. That damn temper getting the best of him every so often.
They don't give a shit, JJ. They want you. I'm telling you, you're gonna land something real top-notch. You proved yourself more than almost anyone.
And Blake, as usual, had been right. A job with more power than JJ ever could have imagined. Once word came down of his posting, he'd done his best to study up on all the new things the job required. Some big-name DC organizations sent him a ton of background materials, including training videos. Stella had always been the better student, so she hunted down articles online so they could learn even more. His 16-year-old son also pitched in. He read it all. But he had to admit, as he did to Stella a few weeks back, a lot of what they'd sent him went over his head. The stuff that dealt more with science. He never liked science much, nor was he good at it. The health department job may have sounded like health and science, but was more about dealing with complaints like long grass, junkyard.
Don't worry, honey. They wouldn't put you there if you weren't up to it.
Then she flashed that cat-like troublemaking smile he loved so much.
Fake it till you make it.
He laughed out loud. That had always been one of his favorite sayings. Once in the heart of DC, JJ soaked it all in. They drove around the Lincoln Memorial, up the mall, past the World War II Memorial. They passed the Ellipse, the place where they'd launched their charge to the Capitol, which had led to prison. It looked so bland now, compared to when the president had fired them all up with that patriotic speech.
And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
A rush of adrenaline pulsed through him even now. Estella assured him over all those years, his actions that day would someday be rewarded. Today was that day. He nodded, satisfied, like a veteran observing a battlefield where he'd earned glory years before. Minutes later, the Uber stopped. "Here you go, sir. You here to take one of the new jobs?" "Sure am," JJ said proudly. "Oh, I've met so many of you lately. We're gonna save our country." The driver eyed JJ through the rearview mirror. The two made eye contact for a split second, but the driver said nothing. No surprise, JJ thought. The guy had some kind of accent you'd never hear back in Clay County. JJ stepped out of the car and walked into the impressive modern building before him. He stared up at the sign at the entrance, took out his camera, snapped a selfie. "From Clay County to Washington, D.C., he texted Stella. "We did it."
We sure did.
She texted back right away.
You did it.
It was 4:59 p.m. He'd never been punctual in past jobs, often cutting corners on both ends of the workday. But now that he'd be in charge, he wanted to send a message from the first day he showed up. The boss has to set the tone. As the elevator door slid open, he stood straight, lifting his shoulders up and puffing his chest out. He'd worked out all through prison and since returning home. Staying fit was another important trait he planned to emphasize. He would again lead by example. A young, pretty blonde with a badge that said Human Relations on it greeted him. In her hand was an envelope. The words, J.J. Newsom, Director, ZID, appeared across the top. ZID? He did a double take. Then he figured out it was the acronym for his new department, Zoologic Infectious Diseases. He hadn't seen it presented that way before. She greeted him with a big smile, handing him the thick envelope as she spoke.
Welcome, Director Newsom. Right on time.
"I trust that's the norm around here," he said seriously. "Fake it till you make it," as Stella said.
I'm sure it will be now. Already an improvement.
They walked down 2 long corridors, a number of staff members watching him stroll past through open doors.
We are so excited to have you starting today. Some are so excited they waited to say hello.
Not only did these folks look happy to see him, some looked familiar to him. Clearly from the list Blake had sent to the White House, and from the group that had gathered on January 5th, which they'd now disbanded. Who needed an outside group when you're on the inside?
They were better dressed than the last time he saw them. Clean shaven, too. Several reached out to shake his hand as he walked by. "Excited to have you here, sir," one heavy-set man said in a deep voice. "Damn proud to work for a patriot like you." Thank you," JJ said. We'll get this place turned around fast." No one had ever talked to him that way back in Clay County, even when he'd managed 3 health workers. Now, JJ felt like a general inspecting his troops. Fake it till you make it. Stella was right. It was working. JJ lengthened his stride, feeling more confident already. At the end of the hallway, they reached a wooden door with a nameplate on the side. Jesse J. Newsom, Director. Director. The young woman waved a card past a keypad just under the nameplate. After a click and the quick flash of a green light, she pushed the door open.
Here you go,
she said as they walked in, then turned the lights on. His eyes opened wide as he scanned around. He bit down on the smile that was forming. It was a bigger, fancier office than any he'd seen in all of Clay County. Bigger than the commissioner's. A corner one, too, with large windows on one side. He'd never had windows before, or a view. The young woman winced at him almost apologetically. "Dr. Hardman didn't clear out until 3:30, but we worked hard to clean it up for you." He nodded his approval. "It'll do just fine." He sat down behind the gleaming desk. He leaned back, swiveled the chair around, and lifted his legs onto the desk. Angling his phone just right, he took a selfie that captured both the wide grin on his face and the new leather boots resting on the desktop. Boots Stella had bought him to celebrate the new job, their new life. He laughed out loud at the photo and then sent it to Stella with a short text. "Made it."